Okay, good morning, everyone. All right, we are hoping that we've corrected some of the technology difficulties that we faced last week, but please bear with us and know that in the future these will be recorded and posted on our website in a far more cohesive manner. My name is Jill Nogueras, and I'm the K-12 English Coordinator here at the Virginia Department of Education. And I want to thank you all for joining us this morning to discuss a rather important topic of reading in the middle, best practices for 6th through 8th grade English classes. We're really excited about this webinar series and hope that you have found them helpful so far and are excited about the opportunities we have in the coming weeks. Just making sure that our slides are actually advancing. If you can just kind of bear with us. Are you seeing the seconds? Okay, great. All right, so we do have the chat feature that you are able to use. Carmen is in here with me trying to monitor that as we can. And if we need to add additional information to the slides before we share them out as a result of questions that come up during the webinar, we will do that before we post the presentation. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to do some quick introductions. We're going to look at some national and state focus areas and research, and then practices that support the 2017 English Standards of Learning, and then instructional resources available from the Virginia Department of Education. And some of this will seem repetitive to some of you who have either watched earlier webinars or have been to any of our events over the last 12 months, but we are trying to echo a lot of best practices in hope that rather you see this as consistency and a constant reminder and hopefully an affirmation of what you are doing in your classrooms right now or out in your divisions. So the first slide that you see here is some research from the National Council for Teachers of English, and it's basically their call to action presentation on what we know about adolescent literacy. It came out in July 2018, and this just kind of sums up a lot of the major components of it. Best practices for success. Basically, we want to make sure that we are incorporating disciplinary literacy instruction. So basically, academic reading requires specialized reading strategies to access complex texts. Teachers must model and show students how to read within different academic disciplines. When authors write for different audiences and purposes, their structures and styles change. So it is important for content area teachers to model for students how to read and analyze text written for different content purposes. We read articles very differently than we read short stories or novels or poetry. So these take different strategies, different comprehension focuses, and really belongs to everyone who touches literacy in a school. Basically, literacy is the linchpin for everything, and so thinking about disciplinary literacy and what that looks like in content area classrooms is just as important as thinking about what literacy looks like in an English classroom. The second point to talk about is the integration of multiple and social literacies. Technology and social media has drastically changed the definition of literacy in the last few decades, even since our own childhoods. Text comes in such a variety of forms, and we need to show students how to interact with all forms, to include bias, validity, credibility, and also show students how to put different texts together to strengthen an argument or a point they are making. Number 3 talks about the orchestration of engagement and motivation. Basically, adolescent readers need sustained experiences with diverse texts in a variety of genres and structures. Opportunities for student choice and voice in independent reading and class reading increase motivation and engagement with text. So this is something you will hear over and over again during today's webinar. Students need choice and voice in what they read in order to become lifelong readers and not just academic readers in school. And then the last point, but rather a major point, our students need an appreciation of multicultural perspectives and cultures. Multicultural literacy is seeing, thinking, reading, writing, listening, and discussing in ways that critically confront and bridge social, cultural, and personal differences. Inclusion of culturally diverse texts allows for students to see themselves in text and embrace the similarities and differences of those around them. It is imperative that we offer students depth and breadth in their literacy development. Many of you have heard of the concept of text as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. So how do students see themselves, identify and have empathy with others, and how can we use these texts and have them act as bridges and doorways to access worlds that are different from our very own? Continuing with that same NCTE position paper, thinking about thinking, we have what adolescent readers need. And these are just a few points from the overall presentation. So I encourage you all to go back and read the entire piece, but these are just the highlights. Students need to practice thinking critically about how they engage with text. And this needs to include the application of metacognitive strategies, the recognition of bias and what a high quality source looks like, and how to include evidence in their argumentation. So thinking about thinking, this idea of metacognition, how often do we ask students to synthesize and determine which strategies will help them engage with and tackle a piece of text? Not when we tell them what to do with a text, but how often are we providing opportunities for students to figure out what strategies would work best for them? We are only going to see this transfer happen when we ask students to think about a text on their own, not when their only experience with text is determined and dictated by the adults in the room. To be successful community members, students need the space and time to learn how to recognize bias, credible sources, and how to determine when to believe what they read. So thinking about this idea of the critical examination of text, we need students to recognize the purpose of text structure and how the writer uses it to create effect. So we need to walk them through how they figure that out, but then we need to give students practice in determining the purpose of text structure on their own. And they need to infer beyond the literal interpretations and then question and investigate social, political, and historical context. So text structure goes hand in hand with writing instruction. We look at text structure from the viewpoint of a writer, but then also we look at it to look at author style and craft. And so really what I'm trying to bring up as a point here is that writing instruction impacts reading comprehension. The two are reciprocal practices. So we need to teach students how to critically examine text for these purposes here, but then also how that impacts their writing and how we are including writing instruction that will show students how to better read and comprehend more challenging texts. As we move into what the position paper talks about in terms of assessment, our students need assessment, classroom assessment, that helps them focus on the larger purpose and big ideas of the curriculum and on metacognitive strategies for thinking during literacy acts. And then preparation for assessment, whether this is classroom, state testing, national testing, but that assessment prep should focus on the critical components of multicultural perspectives, motivation, multiple and social literacies, and shifting literacy demands. And then also this one that I will keep coming back to over and over again, probably the most critical for our students, is choice and volume of reading. Students need opportunities to read often from books of their own choosing. I know some people are cringing out there, but students need time to select their own books. They also need access to a vast library of books and texts that vary in levels and text structures, and dedicated time to read every day. Dedicated time to read in school every day is something that you will hear us say over and over again. Students do not become better readers if we are not giving them time to read in school. And often what we see is students completing worksheets that might have had something to do with something they read once, but the majority of their time is not actually in text, is working on skills that they think support a better understanding of the text. Our students are going to become better readers if they have time in text. And if any of you happen to attend the Raising Readers Conference in Chesterfield this last weekend, then you are very well aware that Donalyn Miller shared and reminded us just this weekend that students aren't going to go home and read on their own and decide to do that of their own choosing if it's not something they were even doing in school. So we need to promote time for students to be in text of their choosing every single day. This comes from Kylene Beers and Robert Propst's Disrupting Thinking. I know a lot of school divisions are using this for their professional development right now. And basically, all I want you to get out of this is the impact of adding 10 minutes of reading, student reading, every single day, what that does for standardized test scores. If you look at this, based on all of these studies, students jump to the 70th percentile rank when given 9.6 minutes of reading every single day in school. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to shadow a student through middle school, but if you do, I highly encourage you to jump on that and see how much time is spent reading. I think you will be shocked at how little time is actually spent in text as opposed to talking about text or lecturing about text, or students in having time to be in text themselves. So just to show you the impact of just adding 10 minutes of dedicated reading time for students in class and the impact that has. And this will be echoed again this afternoon if you join us for the lessons learned. When we interviewed schools, we had a lot of conversations about why reading scores were improving in certain places and, you know, what were some identified best practices. And everyone we spoke to talked about building relationships to build better readers. This idea of knowing your students, knowing their interests, and engaging them in text that will increase their engagement and motivation to read. We are extremely lucky in that English is a skills-based course. So we have the opportunity to build units of studies around essential questions that require students to critically think about a topic that resonates with them. They can learn to summarize, draw conclusions, analyze text structure, organization, and author's purpose from any text. And we need to capitalize on that. So variety is the key. We can always include a whole class selection, whether that's a poem, an article, a chunk of a book, but what they are in when they read independently in our classes, what are they reading, and how can we tap into their natural curiosity to help scaffold and support their learning and independence. So just thinking about this idea of engagement and motivation, and then creating a balance between whole group text and student selected text. And if you spend any time in our curriculum framework, you will also see that we are advocating for engaging students in student selected reading. We do agree there's a place for whole group reading, but there needs to be a balance of student selected reading and whole group reading. And then also just wanted to include, this actually comes from the, this comes from the Association of School Libraries, that basically this is a position statement on the value of independent reading in the school library program. And I think what you'll see here, well, I'm not going to read the screen to you, is basically what school librarians are advocating for, and you'll see echoes of what we're talking about here. Access to books, contact with adults who read regularly, time during the school day, librarians and classroom teachers who demonstrate their enthusiasm of reading, and schools that create an environment where independent reading is valued and promoted and encouraged. So, and then also this idea of involving caregivers and parents and family members. What are we doing as school divisions to support independent reading beyond that of the four walls of our classroom? How are we engaging in dialogue with other members of our school division, our school building, our parents, the partnerships we have with local daycares or after school programs, clubs and sports that happen in our school. How are we working with these people to advocate for student reading? These are all things that will support engagement and motivation and for lifelong learning in middle school. So we're going to move from here to talking about the 2017 English Standards of Learning and what we're promoting at the Virginia Department of Education, as to where you can kind of see echoes of what our research has shown us. And just thinking really quickly about some of the changes that we made in the 2017 Standards of Learning, thinking about alignment with the 5 C's. Everything we're talking about comes back to critical thinking. And really, I mean, all of them, but the idea of thinking about text and getting into, you know, why an author did what they did, and how does that make me feel, and what am I going to do as a result, and how we can tap into that. And basically how we've expanded and included technical reading and writing in our high school grades. So just know, I know this is a middle school webinar, but always something to be thinking ahead, where our students are coming from and where they're going next. Also, to kind of highlight one of the more significant changes we made, best practice has always shown that paired texts engage students and allow them to think critically. And I would agree that school divisions have been naturally doing this, and we've been doing this in middle school for quite some time. But with the 2017 Standards of Learning, we created a standard that asks students to compare and contrast details between literary fiction and informational nonfiction text. So this idea of a paired passage, which means that in the coming years, when students get to 6th grade, they will be far more familiar with this concept and should be able to dig deeper. But basically, we're asking students to analyze those similarities and differences and pair texts and think critically about text in a variety of ways. And hopefully, as we present ideas to students about how to pair text, they will start to, on their own, come up with ways to see text as similar and different and share those ideas with us. But just the idea that pairings could include books, articles, poems, media, graphics, anything of that sort. Text is a very loose term these days. So just to know that has been included down in the upper elementary grades and should impact our middle school readers as they're moving forward. Also, we changed the focus of the writing process, and I'm going to keep coming back to the idea of writing because, again, true writing instruction impacts reading comprehension, and that is just something that I want to make sure I hit home with, because if we are instructing writing and showing students how authors write, we are modeling that through mentor text, which we'll get into in a little bit. But just so that you can see how we have set up the writing standards in the 2017 SOL to be developmentally appropriate and increase in rigor based on what students are able to do in different grade levels. So you can see it expand from just narrative and descriptive to adding an opinion and expository, and then moving over from just having an opinion to looking at how to be persuasive in 5th grade. Then when we get into secondary, you will see that at this point, students have had the opportunity to handle all of the forms of writing so far, and will continue to do so in middle school, but that we've given them 2 different forms of writing per grade level to focus on in order to be prepared for high school. So you'll see this idea of narrative, and we introduce reflective writing in 6th grade, and then looking at expository and persuasive in 7th and 8th. So if you look at the standards, the writing standards for 6th through 8th grade, you'll see a tight marriage between what students are doing in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade reading and what they are doing in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade writing. And that was intentional because as these are reciprocal processes, we want students to be practicing what they are learning in their reading class through their writing and vice versa. So the impact of writing instruction and what that can do for reading comprehension is evident in the standards, and we're hoping that if writing instruction is happening, that we will see gains in our reading comprehension as well. And then just this idea that we do have 4 strands in the 2017 English standards. We have communication and multimodal literacies, reading, writing, and research. And while they are developed separately and listed separately so that you know, as say a 7th grade teacher, what you're responsible for that year, they're not meant to be taught in isolation. They're supposed to be seamlessly integrated in the classroom to the point where students don't know if they're in reading class or writing class, or they don't see research as a separate component all on its own, but something that we're doing as we're reading and writing about something we've learned. And then also the idea that because we are a skills-based course, what we're learning in 3rd grade, we're still actually learning about in 12th grade. It's just what we're doing with that skill that actually changes. So while we might be talking about identifying setting in 3rd grade, we're still thinking about setting as a senior in high school and how the setting impacts what the author was trying to do. So it's just what we do with these skills that change. And so basically what I want to make sure people need to do is that they should look at the curriculum framework to see what students were doing the previous year and what students are doing next. As we know, not all students sit in our classrooms at the exact same grade level. So if we're thinking about differentiation and what we can do to scaffold for students, but then also what we can do to push students who are ready for that extra push, we offer you the curriculum framework for some options of ideas. And I've used this slide quite a bit, but just to kind of reinforce the idea of the vertical articulation of the standards and why each grade level is important and why what each teacher does matters. As you can see, I'm just using text features as an example here. In 1st grade, we're just asking students to identify text features, and we actually even tell you which ones to focus on for 1st graders, what a 6-year-old can handle for text features. And then jumping to 3rd grade, they have to be able to identify text features, but they also have to use them to demonstrate comprehension of nonfiction. And we give you several others, to consider, some new ones. But what I really want you to make sure that you notice is that when we hit 5th grade, the reason we're looking at text features shifts. The purpose of using text features shifts. So if you were to look at that 5th grade standard, it says use text features such as type, headings, and graphics to predict and categorize information. So as we are reading and we're talking about text features, and we've given a couple of examples, we're not identifying text features anymore. Yes, that is the first step in my success. I need to know that, yes, that is a heading, but what I'm doing with the heading has shifted. At this point, we're looking at predicting and categorizing information. So if we're talking about the rigor and alignment of the standards to what students need to be doing in class, we are no longer taking a newspaper at this point and having students highlight and circle the different parts of a newspaper and telling us what they are. We are now asking them to take what they see in that newspaper and make predictions about what they're about to read, or to categorize information if they're looking at a variety of texts. And that's important because the role of text features has shifted. If you look at 8th grade, and I know this is a middle school webinar, but basically we're asking students to apply everything they know. They've been able to identify all of these, they can preview them, they can predict, they can categorize. They have a whole toolbox full of text feature knowledge that they can now use, and they can combine that with their understanding of organizational patterns to analyze the text in front of them. And this is important. This isn't just, again, about creating newsletters and seeing that the kids know how to caption pictures and that they can use a heading and that they can include word art or anything like that, because the purpose that they will be assessed on is analyzing selections, that they can think about and judge a piece based on the information that they have on how it was set up. And then as you can see in 10th and 12th grade, the rigor only increases. But just want to kind of hit home this idea of what the SOL actually says, and making sure that our instruction aligns with the level of rigor of the standard. Because at the end of the year, their assessment will actually align with the standard, not necessarily the activities that we selected to do in our class. So I just kind of highlight that as just a reminder. And then thinking about how we can seamlessly integrate reading, writing, research, and communication multimodal literacies. Several of you, hopefully everybody on this webinar has seen information on this slide here. We have shared it in every presentation we give. It was in a SUPS memo that came out from Dr. Lane, but this is what we need our middle schoolers to do. They need opportunities to read daily. So if you need this slide to advocate for your students, the Virginia Department of Education supports you in the idea that students need opportunities to read daily. They also need to read extended text and grade level material, not 2 paragraphs at the top of a page with 4 multiple choice questions about author's purpose. All right, they need extended text and they need grade level text. They have to have time to read this daily to support their growth as readers, and it needs to include nonfiction and fiction pieces. And then just keeping in mind, and we've talked about this before, but when students are analyzing ideas into text and searching for textual evidence from the text they're reading to support their conclusions, they are engaging in deeper learning and thinking critically, and that is what we want for our students. So thinking about how we can integrate these strands, looking at reading, picking our vocabulary from authentic texts, not from a workbook of Greek and Latin roots that we're studying and handing out a new list on Monday and testing on Friday. Giving our students time with fiction and nonfiction text. And the idea that, you know, while yes, April is National Poetry Month, we don't wait until April to show our students poetry. There's plenty of poetry that we could pull that goes very nicely with nonfiction articles and short stories, and just showing students how we use different strategies to engage with different forms of text, but then how we can use everything we know from these texts to answer questions and think critically about what authors have done. Giving our students a text-rich environment with a variety of text and media, and then allowing for student choice whenever possible. Again, there is always room for a whole group novel, a whole group article, a whole group unit, but what independent texts are we bringing in that allow students to think critically and deeper about whatever essential question we're looking at, and how can we make that meaningful for students? And then bringing in writing as a process for a variety of authentic purposes. Students do not, believe it or not, write for their teachers after they leave that specific grade level. So if we are their only audience all of the time, we are not preparing them for the real world where they are no longer writing to teachers. And your purpose totally changes your style, your format, and what you do with that writing. So showing them how people are writing for different purposes and then allowing them that opportunity as well. Offering writing conferences. I would also argue for reading conferences, and then the use of writing portfolios. And then for students to see research as ongoing, embedded in the learning process. So whenever possible, I Google things probably 15 times a day. So for them to see research as just part of a natural process, a part of a learning process. And then how can we include the multimodal literacies whenever possible, which comes in really under all of the other strands. So thinking about this idea of text-dependent questions, where students actually have to go back into the text to support whatever their answer is, or whatever their defense is of whatever they're arguing. And then including inference questions, and like I said, text-based vocabulary, and then responding to reading whenever possible. Again, coming back to this idea of paired texts and creating text sets, I want to once again bring up the idea that your school librarian is an incredibly valuable resource. With enough lead time, they would happily support you in pulling text around an essential topic, or time period or location or theme. So you don't have to spend the time doing that, but that would support a deeper understanding of whatever concept you're trying to teach, that would allow for that student choice and voice. But then, you know, everybody could still be thinking about the same questions and digging for the same answers, but looking at different texts. So what opportunities do we have to create meaningful experiences with text sets and paired texts to bring students in and engage them in their learning? And then just thinking about how could we do this? Could we choose a theme or a topic or an essential question just to build this knowledge base around? And then once I have that theme or topic, what text or media options do I have available that will support student learning about it? And how can I bring in all of the different strands to that learning? And then looking at the text that I have, what standards am I really going to cover? And are these standards we have examined before, so this is just a review, or are some of them new that are going to take a little bit more time, and where do I want to intentionally fit those in? So what will interest your students? And then providing that opportunity and time for shared and independent reading. And then the idea of modeling the writing process and meeting with students for writing conferences. It is when they are writing about what they have read that you truly see if they understood everything you were trying to get at. So not talking about writing to a random prompt, but if they are writing in response to something you have asked and something they have been engaged in and critically thinking about, that is where you will see if they have understanding of the material. And when we've created these units, we want ourselves to be able to answer yes to all of these questions. When we think about it, this is what's truly important for our students. Do the materials that we select thematically link genres and texts together for maximum impact? Can we say yes to that? And if we can't, what do we need to do differently next time? Did the experiences provide an opportunity for students to think critically and examine and evaluate whatever question posed to them? And were the students given the opportunity to demonstrate their understanding of the material and apply the skills? And how did I do that? Is that through a piece of writing? Is that through a multimodal presentation? Is that through a Socratic seminar or debate? And I'm using my communication skills. Were they given the opportunity, and how do you know? What other models of assessment, both formative and summative, were used on this unit? But I want to come back to this idea of the reading-writing connection, because you're going to hear this probably throughout the rest of our webinars about the reciprocal process and having students think about reading from the viewpoint of a writer and write thinking about everything they've learned in reading. So using mentor text to read like a writer and write like a reader. This allows students to imitate an author's style and structure and appreciate author's craft. If this is something you've been instructing and working on for a long time, there is nothing more satisfying than a student coming up to you and telling you about something they read on their own and pointing out to you what the author did. That is the big aha moment. And when they can point it out to you, they are pretty much ready to try to imitate that style and structure on their own, because they've seen it modeled and they know how to identify it when they see it. But then this idea of incorporating daily writing. Daily writing does not mean a 5-paragraph essay. Daily writing might be responding to a quote on the board, putting something in a discussion board. There could be a warm-up. There could be some formative assessment ongoing, or they might just have to respond at the end of a class period or unit or experiment where they write their thoughts and share maybe how something that they thought was different and how their thinking has changed as a result of everything you've done in class. And just this idea of authentic writing opportunities. Our students are far more savvy with social media than we are. So how can we use that to our advantage? There are a lot of child-friendly, classroom-friendly social media connections that are far more closed, where students aren't really writing out on the internet, but allow them the opportunity to share their voice and critically think about all they've read and share that in writing in a way that is engaging to students, but also demonstrates for a teacher what a student has learned. And just thinking about, because I know it's heavy on your minds as middle school teachers, the elimination of the grade 5 writing SOL and how that has impacted writing and research instruction for our middle school students. Writing is not just an English thing. I'll say that again. Writing is not just an English thing, and something that should be happening in all middle school classrooms across the state, but it should be included in all curricular areas. And just, you know, something to think about. How much writing does your job require? And this is something that, if you think about it, I guarantee you don't go a day without writing something. So knowing that our students need these skills and they need support, what can we do to include writing instruction, and how can we make that work together with reading that strengthens both programs and supports that writing instruction, so that 8th grade teachers are not bombarded at the end of the year as they get ready for the 8th grade writing SOL. So thinking about that, some of the unintended consequences of removing that 5th grade writing SOL is that there is far more focus on reading instruction. And so I'm here to advocate that reading and writing go together and need to happen together. But as a result, since we have focused more of our time on reading skills and reading comprehension, most of our writing in middle school classes is just assigned. So what you see on the left here is what happens when writing is assigned, and what you see what happens on the right is what happens when writing is taught. So there's a great difference between assigning writing and teaching writing. Although all students can write, direct instruction by the teacher is needed to develop an awareness of good writing and the skills needed to create it. So direct instruction of concepts such as audience and purpose and skills such as revision can be followed by student choice and reflection. Then, as the writing begins, the instruction continues with teacher modeling. So when writing is taught, teachers model. Modeling is one of the most effective instructional strategies, and that is true in writing as well as other areas. Teachers should write as students are writing and then model the steps in the writing process, fine-tuning the modeling to meet the student's needs. If composing is the weakest area, then the teacher might conduct a think aloud through the process of selecting main ideas and developing organization and elaboration. If first drafts are generally solid, but the revision is lacking, then a teacher could model strategies such as developing sentence variety or replacing bland language for more vivid vocabulary, and really modeling for students. We do this with our reading. We think aloud a lot in our reading, but how do we show that with our writing? Because again, when students can figure out how to organize a paper to make their main point and to style their paper and include that word choice, I guarantee they can find it in whatever they read. So I'm just bringing back this idea that when we actually instruct writing and not just assign it, our students become stronger readers. So just kind of keeping that in mind. And then just some possible unit layout suggestions to create a flow between reading and writing and how that might look, and how you can marry the two together, and how you'll select mentor texts for reading, but then also how can you use those same mentor texts for writing? What are some pieces? How can you use that text again to support reading and writing so that students can read a text as a reader and a writer, and they can make those connections? That also helps students think of themselves as writers as well. So just some ideas here. I won't spend any time because I'm going to send this presentation to you, but just one opportunity of how you could put these things together. I'm going to quickly go through some of the available English resources that the Virginia Department of Education offers so that you are aware of how to get to them. We do have an updated 2017 English curriculum framework. It looks like this. So if you are using the old one, please stop. We have moved on. At this point, please use 2017 because we are in our full implementation year. We did make some changes, but just a few reminders. This curriculum framework is not everything. I repeat that. It's not everything. It's just a framework. As classroom teachers, you are the experts for what your students need and what your community desires, and you need to build upon what's available as resources to you. So it's not supposed to be everything, but it's also not supposed to limit what's taught in the classroom. If your students are able to do everything that's in your grade level curriculum framework, by all means, please move on. Think about how you can challenge your students next. I also bring up that the essential knowledge, skills, and processes is not a one-to-one match of the standards. This is a change, and I know for some school divisions, lesson plans require that if you pull something from the standards, you have to have the essential knowledge, skills, and process that matches that. And I'm here to tell you that some of them do not have a match. So if the standard is self-explanatory, we're not going to have additional information. The curriculum framework is around 300 pages in length, and I realize that the fastest way to get to your grade level is to hit Control Find and put in whatever number you're looking for. But I would encourage you to back up one more page and look at the overview of the Strand on the Strand introduction page, because that's where we have included teacher notes that bring in research best practices and pedagogies. Where you can find that, and instructional strategies that work to support learning for students. We removed the understanding the standard page because that information is pretty much on the introduction, and we basically just have the 3 pieces. So just to give you a quick overview, this is what the introduction page looks like, and this is where the teacher notes should help guide you. So as you can see, we advocate on here the integration of the standards, that vocabulary should come from student reading rather than prescribed lists, that teachers need to introduce students to longer, more complex texts, both on grade level and above grade level. And I realize that that above grade level might come in the form of a read aloud. We're not asking you to frustrate your students, but they do need to be exposed to additional vocabulary and hear what good reading sounds like. So this might be one way that you could do that. So all of your best practices can be identified here. And now this is what your inside page would look like. So for instance, if you see 7.6G reads identify the main idea, you'll see there is nothing below about identifying the main idea because there isn't any way to break that down. However, if you look at 7.6A, what it talks about skimming materials and using text features, we have given you some additional text features that you might come across in grade level material. So that's the other thing I want to make sure I point out here. These are listed not to limit you and not to say that they align with assessment entirely, because they are not. Assessment is not built off of this curriculum framework, but this is more showing you and demonstrating what would be in a grade level text. These are some of the text features you would see that may not be, say, in a first or second grade text. So these align with grade level material. We've also updated the SOL progression chart. So if you're using blue ones, please throw those away. Those are from 2010. We are all things orange now. So we have that for communication, multimodal literacies, reading, writing, grammar, and research. So if you are interested in where a student concept or skill is introduced, you can find that in these progression charts. You can see where it's introduced and then where a student might be considered proficient and progressing. And then also the crosswalk between the 2017 and the 2010 standards. Some people find this very exciting. Others don't find it helpful at all. At this point, since we are in our full implementation year, I say just teach the 2017 standards of learning. This might come in handy, though, if you are really familiar with the grade level that you've been teaching, say 8th grade for a really long time, and we added new content in there that you've never been responsible for before. This document would allow you to look at 8th grade and see right away if something is new content. And I'm saying 8th grade, but the same is evident in every grade level. I'm just using that as my example right now. So it might prove helpful to look at this, to look at the crosswalk, to see where new content is there, especially if it is content that will be assessed on the end of year standards of learning assessment. Also, we have updated our instructional plans, formerly known as the Enhanced Scope and Sequence. Those materials still exist on our website, but they do not align with the 2017 standards. So I encourage everyone to take a look at our English instructional plans. Right now, we have roughly 100 posted. And I'm just showing you a screenshot of the introduction there, but they are posted by strand, and then within strand say reading, as you can see here, fiction and then nonfiction. And what you see here is the different plans listed by grade level bands and their primary SOL. But what you're going to find if you were to open any of these is that the instructional plan samples that we posted here have a primary strand, but because we are advocates of integrating strands and bringing in other strands to reinforce ideas or to scaffold and structure things for students, you'll see that we have a primary SOL and then that reinforced SOL. These vary in length, but once you hit secondary, they do, I mean, if you were to use all of them, you could probably spend up to 2 weeks in one plan, depending on what you're doing with it. We have provided potential texts, but please don't think that you have to use the texts that are listed there. In fact, I would encourage you to read through the plans, and you might find that some texts that you're really excited about and that your students get really into works better than the text you see here. But look at these for ideas, how to hit the rigor of the standard, how you might integrate other ideas. And then also we've included academic language for English language learners, steps for remediation or differentiation in there, and then also you'll see writing included in all of these. If it's a writing lesson, you'll see how to bring in mentor text and bring in some reading to go with that, and then also different methods of assessment. So if you haven't had the opportunity, I encourage you to take a look at these. But we didn't want to let today's webinar end without thinking about all that a middle school teacher has to do and where we can get some support to engage our students and motivate them and get deep into this instruction with the limited time we have. So thinking about how we can make time for meaningful reading and writing instruction. Well, if our English and history specialist was here today, he would present on this, how to bring in content area reading and how to partner with our history teachers that we have in every middle school. And I hope I can even do a little bit of justice to what he has provided here, but he will update with other content as necessary. But thinking about bridging the gap to adolescent literacy and how we can use content area standards of learning as support. So how can we work with other content teachers and allow for student choice? Obviously, we would advocate for no rigid reading or writing lists, but how can we include history and bringing in other content in, because again, we are a skills-based course. So how could we work with our US1 and US2 teachers to engage students in critical thinking around text and then writing about that? So obviously, as by now you are aware that the guidelines for local alternative assessments really encourage the idea of performance assessments that integrate multiple subject areas. So thinking here, a local assessment might address content from U.S. History 1 and 6th grade English. What could this look like? And for our friends, our history friends who don't always feel like they have time to teach history the way they want, how can they bring in these historical concepts in a way that really address reading comprehension, but get at some of the heart of what the history teachers are trying to consider? So how to bring nonfiction passages that align to history content, but also leverage current events to increase engagement and just deep questions that students want to explore. So thinking about courage and bravery in local history, here are just a few pieces that we could pair, looking at a story, a newspaper article, and a poem kind of thinking about civil rights and social justice and courage and bravery, and how can we put these things together and really consider the historical context, but also those reading comprehension strategies that we're trying to get at. Thinking about using historical themes and then identifying fiction or poetry that fit our nonfiction content that could work together. So again, looking at U.S. history, this would be U.S. 2, looking at the J.C. Bus Travel Outlawed, the article, and then taking pieces from What Everybody Knows Now by Jacqueline Woodson. How do we put those together? And how do we get students to critically think and engage in text? And just looking at, you know, the real heart of this, what the kinds of questions that a history teacher could ask about this, but just the rich language and comprehension questions that we could ask about these pieces. Looking at these two ideas of Sacagawea, asking students to decide if the version of her in the primary source that's here from the journals of Lewis and Clark is reflected by the one in the statue, where you see her kind of hovering behind Lewis and Clark in this Charlottesville statue, and just getting kids to critically examine and think about text together. So we have these teachers in our buildings who we could work collaboratively with, where we could support one another and engage students in critical thinking and thinking about historical context and perspective and bias, and how we can put these things together for students to have meaningful discussion and opportunities to discuss and read and write and research and everything we do in English, but have that supported in other classroom areas as well. And we're gonna look into this more in the coming webinars when we talk about writing in the history classroom and interdisciplinary, looking at how we engage students in writing and reading and science. So these will be upcoming webinars all on their own, but just thinking about how we can put these things together to create meaningful opportunities for students in multiple classrooms and get students reading and thinking about reading all day long. It's, again, not just an English thing. And then just showing you how our progression chart aligns very nicely with the history, social science progression chart. So you can see where these things align and how they work together. This was done intentionally. The history, standards, and skills progression charts were written to align with English so that we could have some reciprocal support. And all I have listed here are the research pieces that we discussed during this webinar, so that if you want to look into them more completely, here is your research. Certainly hope you do engage in some discussions about this back in your school divisions. And then also, I'm just going to leave you, obviously, with our contact information. We are happy to answer questions as you're moving forward, especially as you're coming up with innovative ways to engage students in reading and writing at the middle school level. And we just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. Please know that this afternoon we're going to explore the lessons learned from our interviews that we held this fall with school divisions and schools that saw an increase in their reading comprehension and their reading SOL scores. And that was elementary, middle, and high school. But I think you can glean a lot of best practices from the results of those interviews. So I hope you have time to join us this afternoon at 2 o'clock for that. If you are unavailable at 2 o'clock, that webinar will be repeated on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. So you will have another opportunity to hear that. We'll be collaborating with our colleagues in the Office of Assessment for those webinars. So we hope you can come back and join us for those. Again, we hope that this morning's session was helpful and fruitful for all of you, and we look forward to hearing from you and working with you in the future. Thank you so much for your time and attention this morning. Wow, I'm already fast forwarding the day. But we hope you have a great day. We hope you learned something new, and please share it with a friend. Thank you.